Hello, welcome to Financial Modeling with Power BI. So, for those who don't know me, my name is Bob Duffy. So, I've been around the sort of data warehousing and business intelligence platform on Microsoft for a long time. I'm a SQL Server Ranger or a certified architect. I'm also an analysis services maestro. I guess the most kind of relevant thing for this talk is I spend my time as a database architect at Prodata in sort of Dublin, helping enterprise customers develop data warehouses and business intelligence generally on top of ERPs, and a big part of that is core finance data. And that's really where this talk comes from, our experience of helping global enterprises implement financial reporting. If you want to follow me, I've got the usual blog, Twitter, and so forth, and that's all there. So what we're going to cover is now, I'm calling it modeling. I've got to be very careful when I use the term kind of modeling because I don't mean financial modeling, i.e., what if analysis. I mean data modeling, right? How do you model your core finance kind of data structures optimal for Power BI or any business intelligence to convert it from a paper format into something that's on screen, analytical, slice and dice? Okay, so we're going to go through 7 key sort of challenges here, right? And if you can overcome these 7 kind of challenges, you should have smooth and fluid financial reporting and a happy finance team. Just to be clear, we're mainly talking about the data modeling aspect, what tables do you need, what columns, how do you format BI. I'm not going too much into the detail about the sort of data viz, right? I'm more talking about the pro forma reports of things like P&L, balance sheet, cash flow. These are kind of statutory reporting, but also the most common reports used to analyze an enterprise, and the metrics contained within those are also used as KPIs to do further analytics, right? So there's super important suite of reports there, right? So for financial reporting, just to kind of narrow the scope as to what we're talking about, finance is a very wide area, right? So typically when we implement finance for an ERP customer, it's split into a few modules, right? What we're going to be looking at is the GL or the general ledger, sometimes called core finance, right? But other areas could be AP, accounts payable, invoicing and so forth, accounts receivable. That's going to be sort of debt collection and stuff like that. And then, financial analysis of stock, price variation, cost of goods sold. There's all manner of aspects of finance that look at various parts of the business, right? But we're just going to be focusing in on the general ledger in this particular talk. And there's a holy trinity of reports that make up the kind of general ledger, right? Your profit and loss, which I think the Americans refer to as the income statement, the balance sheet, and only when you've done both of those perfect can you move on to the cash flow, because the cash flow is kind of an amalgamation of the two. It's showing the flow of cash through the enterprise and comparing it to the opening and closing kind of balance. So the cash flow is kind of an important report for most of our customers to check that the accounting process is kind of solid and that we've got like an audit match, right? If there's an error in your cash flow, there's probably an error in your reporting or your accounting process, right? So come back to those 7 kind of challenges, right? And before we look at those in a lot of detail, on the right-hand side, so when you first approach a large customer and they're like, hey, we want you to design a profit and loss in the BI tool. Well, the first kind of question to ask is why, right? Because most ERPs have some sort of reporting tool, right? And you'd think these sort of reports should just be a push a button, get them out of the ERP, right? And if you can, you obviously don't need BI, right? So you don't need kind of Power BI, right? So the use case for Power BI is when they want a more flexible report format. So they want to slice and dice and drill down, and the ERP itself could be very fixed and static. Think about it like reporting services. It's a printout, and they want something that's on screen and soft copy and flexible, right? The other thing is very common. The ERP is used for the running of the business, but it doesn't contain enough to generate the consolidated profit and loss, because the way that the account codes are rolled up for reporting purposes are different than how they're stored. And sometimes the ERP either doesn't have those structures or it has those structures but it doesn't render them very well. So it's done in the BI tool. And sometimes those rules and structures aren't even stored within the ERP, which is a bit of a shock, but that can happen, right? So on the right hand side of the screen is how you would typically get a spec for something like a profit and loss. It'll always be in Excel. So they hand you a spreadsheet and say, I want it like this. And when you have a quick look at it, you'll notice that it contains items, right, which are in a hierarchy. So generally, it's always a two-level hierarchy. You have a header, and then you have a line item underneath that. And the items are summed up by GL codes or account codes, which is generally a 4 or a 6-digit code within the accounts kind of package, right? And accountants are usually very good as to how they organize those codes. For example, everything that starts with a 4 is a cell, right? And then a 4.2 is one type of cell, and then a 4.5 is another type of cell. So they split up those GL codes as a network administrator would split up kind of subnets, and generally they're very organized. But exceptions do happen, right? Where, say, for example, the rule is that a 4 is a cell, except for this one code is a discount, so it's actually like a negative cell. Or they have a range, but there's something in the middle of the range that's not part of that range, right? So nothing in the world is 100% clean, right? The report will contain subtotals, but they want the subtotal to be a line item on the report. And they've also got other lines that are not roll-ups, but they're calculations. For example, net invoice sales here. Now they express it like the finance team will say, well, that equals gross sales minus discounts, right? So they're specifying it backwards, right? But you could also kind of see that as a running sum. So calculation-wise, it's easier to see the calculations as running sum. So we have ranges and we have like calculated members that have to be injected into the hierarchies, and it's hierarchical, right? That's kind of it. And you've got some key performance indicators at the bottom. EBITDA, is a very common metric to run the enterprise by, right? And that's going to be profit minus interest, minus tax, kind of minus amortization. So earnings before interest, tax, and amortization, EBITDA. There is also an EBITDA, right, which would also exclude depreciation, say, right? But anyway, so this is the report that we need to make, right? So the first thing that we need is the chart of accounts. So the chart of accounts gives us those 4 or 6-digit codes that every time something is posted, you'd effectively have a debit to one account and a credit to another account. So it's the heart of the GL system as such, right? Now, so what I've done on screen is a copy of what we get out of AdventureWorks. So I'm actually using AdventureWorks, not the AdventureWorks that most people would know. So most people look at AdventureWorks and they look at, internet sales and reseller sales, right? But actually hidden within AdventureWorks is a mini ERP because it's got a chart of accounts and it's got a general ledger and it's got a few other bits and pieces that would be very similar to if you had a SAP, an M3, or even a QuickBooks or Microsoft Dynamics. Any accounts package would kind of look like that, right? So sometimes the chart of accounts can be parent-child. So in here, if we look at account code 1, that's actually balance sheet, which is kind of defining the report. Account code 10 is assets, and then we see that assets has a child which is current assets, and I'd hope it's got another child of non-current assets. That's probably not a screen. And then current assets has got children of cash and receivables, right? So those are assets, right? And then the profit and loss would also be defined like that, right? Now, how AdventureWorks has done it is a bad idea, right? Because it's trying to define the reporting structure of the elements within the chart of accounts. And usually there's kind of a many-to-many thing going on. And if you define it like that, you won't have the calculated members as well, right? So we would never recommend doing it this way, but if it's how the kind of data comes, we've got to work with it, right? Some accounts would usually be assets and some would be liabilities. And this is very important because how you get the data, it could be inverted. So you could have a liability, but it comes in as a positive. And we'll talk about that kind of later on. And you've got to transform that, right? So that's the chart of accounts, right? And when you bring in the tables, if you're lucky, your ERP will have a star schema like this. Right now, it usually have a few extra ones because it'll have a cost center. The key thing to understand is nearly every P in the world is built for multiple industries. And what that means is the dimensionality is flexible, right? So your general ledger will have keys that can be reused for different purposes to point to different dimensions. So in this example, we have a key of organization, department, scenario, right? Well, another one could have product group, customer group, right? Or something like that. Or manufacturing process could have plant, right? So within the RP, these keys will generally come out as key 1, key 2, key 3, key 4, because they don't have a defined name. They're repurposed as part of the ERP implementation. That's fine, because when we import it and we do the semantic modeling, we can obviously put the proper name on it for what that is, right? So this is what I've done, and AdventureWorks doesn't actually have that complexity, right? Which is quite unusual, but it is only an example database, right? So I noticed in this one that we're also missing cost center. I've never seen a financial system that doesn't have the concept of a cost center, right? But that's how it is, right? So this is the basic model that you can get started in, and you can kind of almost get a report from this because you've got your reporting dimensions, and this is a parent-child, and you've got your financial values that come from your general ledger transactions, right? So what I've done, just as a first start, is I've gone to AdventureWorks, opened up kind of Power BI, next, and I produced a report without too much modeling at all. So literally, we just have a measure called the amount, which is just the sum of the value in the transactions, right? Now, because it was a parent-child, and only some ERPs are parent-child, most of them are what we call naturalized, where it will have, heading and subheading as part of the chart of accounts. But in this case, it is a parent-child. We have to do a flattening of that parent-child into levels in order to render it within Power BI. And that's exactly what we've done. So let's have a look at this naive example that you could do in a couple of minutes, right? So I flip to Power BI. And if we look at the data model, that's exactly what I've done, right? So I've brought in my general ledger. I've just literally gone get data. Now, I've got these available as CSV and Excel files, and I'll put this up on a GitHub if you want to play with it. If you do have AdventureWorks, you can just connect to the SQL Server and kind of suck it in as well, right? I've brought in this, I've added the joins, and the only extra work I've done is on the naturalization of the hierarchy. We'll go into that in a little bit more detail, but the key thing is the end result is I've now kind of got what you could see as a profit and loss, right? So this is just aggregating by what's in the chart of accounts. Interesting enough, they've got a 3-level hierarchy, and it's actually sometimes a 5 or 6 kind of level hierarchy, which is very unusual. It's usually only a 2-level hierarchy, and I can select between show me the income report, the balance sheet, and often a general ledger will have statistics in there, because if you're doing effectively overhead allocation, you could say I've got an amount of rent, but I'm going to charge my different areas per square foot of building they have. So you have to have non-financial metrics within a general ledger sometimes. So that's kind of called a stats account, right? So it's not holding money, it's holding metrics that are used to do allocation. Now we're only looking at the a profit and loss, and it kind of looks like this, right? Now, clearly, one thing you will recognize is that it doesn't really work, right? Because if we look at gross margin is 181, so we sold 181 and our expenses were 50. So you'd think, well, the net margin should be 130. But you see, the problem is it's added these up. That's kind of the first problem that we're kind of look at is you've got to get it to work before you can kind of do anything, right? So let's flip back to presentation. First thing we're going to do is get it to work, right? So the problem is that thing that I mentioned of signage, where liabilities can be expecting a positive value, and you kind of want them to subtract. Now, there's two ways of doing this. You could try and do this at DAX time, have sum X over the account and say, hey, well, if it's a liability, then kind of make it a negative. Now, we would never advise doing that, right? You always want to push any business logic down to out of the report and into the data model, right? Which is where it's going to be better housed, right? So once you've corrected that, you'll find you then get the correct figure. Okay, so that's the incorrect figure, and when it's corrected, I'll get the correct figure. Okay, now the way that I corrected that, there's lots of different ways of doing it. I said you could do it in DAX, but we wouldn't recommend that. You can also do that in Power Query by using an M function, which is an if statement. Say, hey, if it's an expenditure, then it's -1. Otherwise, it is an asset, right? I'll just show you that. So here's Power BI. I go to my Power Query editor, and when I'm on my general ledger, you can see I've joined the DIM account to this, so I can bring in the so I now understand the account type, and then I can apply a formula for that, which is an if statement to multiply it by -1. I get a new column, so I take the amount that they give us and I create this sort of other column, and then I can delete that one and we just use that base amount column. Now notice I call it base amount because I want my measure to be called amount, so I renamed the base column and then I hide that, right? Because we don't want a user's accessing the base measures generally, right? So just show that in the M. This is what that look like, and you see that if statement. Now, one of the nice things about Power Query is, although I'm showing the M code, you kind of do this by using the wizard. Now, for most of our customers, we would generally have a data warehouse underneath that. And if so, then obviously, as you do your ETL work to bring in the transactions, you're going to do that kind of transform then. I'm only doing it in Power Query if you're literally slapping Power BI direct on top of the ERP, which, is a very cheap alternative to building a data warehouse if you're doing a full load every time, right? Right, so that's a look at the signage, right? Very easy thing to fix, fairly trivial, right? Now, with the ragged hierarchy and indeed dealing with the hierarchy then, one of the things I didn't show you is Power BI doesn't handle parent-child very well if they're ragged, like some of the elements are two levels and some are 4 levels. You get this effect on screen where, as you click the plus, it's just empty because there's no child. Now, dealing with parent-child hierarchies is very well documented. The Italians on their kind of DAX patterns have some good blogs and tips and stuff like that can be quite complex, right? And that's one of the unfortunate things of Power BI is the older MOLAP engine had kind of native ways of saying, hey, hide these kind of child members and just sort of make it look right. Power BI doesn't yet kind of have those features, well, in a supported way, right? So I'll show you a demo of how we do that. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a demo of how we deal with the hierarchy, right? So here you see the ragged hierarchy, but how did I even get this hierarchy to render? Well, what I would have done is I've gone to the table and we added calculated columns, right? We've got this parent-child column, so this parent-child, okay? And what we're doing is then there's this DAX function of path that gives the parent-child, and you see it naturalizes it to render out the sort of path as a single string. Once I do that, so that's the path function, there's then this path item function that says, well, give me the item at level 2 or at level 1, 2, 3, and it'll return that kind of number, and that'll give me the key. And then I use a lookup value to say, hey, look up that key and return the account name. And what I get is this flattened hierarchy that I can then use natively in Power BI to actually make a proper hierarchy. So I think I made this hierarchy of account, we can drag that on a report, and if it's a matrix view, you get that nice sort of plus appear, right? Well, I say nice, the icon on the plus isn't that great, right? But you, you get the effect. Now, dealing with the raggedness is slightly harder, right? And it's only been the last few years the DAX language has been improved a little bit to help with the support. So to handle this, what we do is we record what the max depth of an individual row is. So if we look at this first one, that's only too deep because it's only assets, right? So we've got balance sheet, assets, it's too deep. If we go to work in progress, it's 5 deep, okay? Because we've got balance, assets, and then 3, which is current assets, 9, which is inventory, and then 11, which is work in progress. So it's kind of a hierarchy there, right? So it's max 5 deep. So we now know if the scope of where you're currently at is greater than 5, it's not valid, and you probably don't want to display that. So what we do is we return a null on the amount, so the non-empty behavior, it eliminates that row, and the raggedness disappears. So you can see that there'll be a DAX function that we added called scope, right? Probably added it to the general ledger. Oh, hold on. View hidden. Here we go. Just find that. Oh, I'm looking at the wrong workbook. Sorry, this is the before workbook. And then here's a workbook where I've cleaned it up, right? Now, if you look at the hierarchy, taxes, when I click plus, they don't expand, okay? And indeed, if this was a fixed layout, I'd probably get rid of the plus as well, right? So you can go into the properties, and you can take off the row headers to get rid of the sort of plus or minus. See the plus or minus icons? I get rid of that, and I give it a cleaner look, right? So it looks more like a pro forma layout, right? So how do I get rid of that ragged element then? Is I added this little helper function to determine the scope, right? View hidden. There we go. This account scope. So what we're doing is this is in scope function, which is relatively new to Power BI. Well, I say new, is probably 3 or 4 years at this point, right? But we can say is the level 6 in scope, if not is level 5, and through this we get a number to say where they have navigated to, and then within we can then use some DAX to say, hey, return a null if it's not valid, and we just multiply the amount by the flag, right? So that's kind of how we deal with kind of ragged hierarchies. Now, if you're lucky, your ERP does not have a parent-child, right? We've been looking at them. I think Microsoft Dynamics does, QuickBooks does, AdventureWorks does, but certainly SAP, M3, and a load of other ERPs don't, right? So it's the luck of the draw. But if you do have a parent-child, that's kind of how you deal with it, right? Now, onto a more interesting kind of problem, right? The pro forma layout, right? So if you look at the naive format that we got on the profit and loss, right? We just got all of the elements that are rolled up from the chart of accounts, right? We don't have the calculated members, the subtotals, the KPIs, and the calculations that the financial accountants want that form part of the profit and loss. So specifically, net invoice sales. I mean, that is a calculation that can be either seen by the finance team, see it as a backwards, gross sales minus discounts, but we can see it as a running sum, right? And subtotals, running sums, and KPIs, pardon me, that in this case are kind of running sums as well, right? How do we represent those? Because the finance team are very unforgiving. Like, we're not going to be able to say, oh, well, we can give you it except for these lines on the report. It's a pro forma layout. You have to give it exactly as it's laid out with the subtotal. They're not going to accept the subtotal at the top. It's got to be in the exact same place, right? So there's a few ways of doing this, right? The problem is these items are not going to be in the chart of accounts. So this is really the most fundamental part of this kind of session, is how do you do that? And the first realization is that your chart of accounts is not suitable for reporting because it doesn't have those reporting elements. So what you need is a reporting dimension, a completely separate dimension that stores the metadata, i.e. what are the headings, what are the subheadings, and what are these kind of calculated members, right? And once you create that table, we're then going to apply a different style of thinking on how we create that, right? And this is really the secret sauce that we do differently. Well, I say differently because I'm kind of spreading the word, and hopefully a few other people are going to be doing it this way as well, right? So starting point, we soft code the report, right? So if you look at this, this is just an Excel spreadsheet with a representation of the report. I'll just flip back so you can see the report, gross sales and then trade sales. So gross sales is the heading, trade sales is the section. So here I've got my two-level hierarchy. Gross sales is a sum, right? So it's a sum of some accounts, but we haven't defined which GL codes yet, right? Net invoice sales is a running sum, right? Now in this case it's a subtotal, right? But because it's the first item, a subtotal is kind of the same as a running sum, right? But operating expenses is a bit different, and that is a subtotal. So it's just a subtotal over a small part and not a running sum, right? So I've actually defined it as a running sum, right? But cost of sales, as I said, we've defined as a custom calculation, right? Now on some of ours, we actually have an operator of subtotal, right? It's implicit that it's the subtotal of all of the items underneath that, right? Okay. So that's the metadata we have, and we have a different section for profit and loss, balance sheet, and sometimes cash flow, right? Then we have a map table, right? And the business rules table tells us for each report section, so for reporting line 1, which is trade sales. Now notice I've repeated the name just for readability purposes. From a OLTP kind of modeling perspective, you obviously only need the key, but because some of these mapping tables are maintained kind of half by the business, we put the kind of name in there as well. And then we define what account ranges the from and the to range make up that. If you're lucky, each line on the report is just a clean range, right? Now here in AdventureWorks, it's just one range, which is very unusual. But if we look at returns and adjustments, we can see, oh, that's actually 9 ranges there. I'll just zoom in on that so you can see that. So we can see that's actually 9. And where we've got a split range, if we look at administration, so administration should be 6,400 to 6,200 to 6,920, but there's these gaps in the middle where some of the codes have been robbed by other ones. So this is what we call a messy structure, but we can still kind of model it, right? It's not the end of the world. It's just it's not as clean as you'd hope for, right? So once we've kind of modeled that, we then create a many-to-many table that says what lines on the report relate to what account codes, and bear in mind that some of the lines on the report are running sums, right? So that creates this kind of many-to-many where we no longer use the account code as the reporting, as what's dragged onto the report. We use a different dimension, the financial report, okay? And this map table shows us which account codes roll up to which line on the report. Now, obviously for base elements, it's fairly straightforward, but for running sums, it's a little bit harder. So we've got to build this many-to-many, and this is the kind of data engineering and the data processing part, right? First of all, we obviously need the rules, right? So either the rules are in the ERP or they're not in the ERP, and we've got to hold them external. Simple as that, right? Some ERPs have it, like I gave this talk in New Zealand, and someone was working with the Dynamics, and they found, yeah, in the chart of accounts, there was a column that had a delimited string of all the ranges that kind of made that up, right? Other tables can have it in a more kind of denormalized form, and some of them don't have it at all, and it's maintained outside the spreadsheet, right? So the starting point is you have these 3 kind of tables. We have the financial report in the middle. So that's what I'm going to actually, that's what I've kind of made up as my report. The chart of account saying, well, what account codes is each kind of line item, and then this map table saying, well, a from and a to range, and how does that map to the report, right? So this map table is what you got to find or make up, right? Now, once you make that up, you first of all build your base elements, your sums, right? So if we look at customer sales is a sum, and 1120 to 120, right? Which is actually only one item, right? Oh no, sorry, it's two items because it's inclusive, right? So the entry in the map table goes one maps to, so report line one maps to account key one. Now it could be GL codes, it might be a business key kind of rather than a surrogate key. And often with a chart of accounts, we do use a business key because chart of account codes don't change, right? So that's fine. So now I know that when I drag on customer sales, I'm going to get these two account codes kind of summed up, right? Then I move to trade sales. Well, trade sales is 1201 to 1250, but there's only one account code that actually fits in that range at the moment. At a later date, someone could slot one in there, right? So there's just one line goes in my many-to-many. And the same goes for trade sales. There's actually just one line that fits that. So sorry, trade sales. Sorry, got a bit confused there. Number 3 is a running sum. Okay, so you see that 3 is a running sum. So for 3, I've got to sum up all of the previous ones. So see, for 3, it's 1, 2, and 3. So now my running sum is now physically part of the data model. It's not a calculation, right? So when I click on the sales kind of total, the many-to-many join is going to sum up all the account codes that make up there. So we've converted something from a calculation into just a natural part of the model, right? And we work our way down and follow that kind of logic all the way down, right? Now, depending on your model is how you do that, right? You can either do that if you've got a data warehouse. It's very easy to do that in T-SQL, right? Because T-SQL has a concept of a between clause, right? If you're doing it in Power, so say for example, you've got a set of flat files and you're loading straight into Power BI, it's slightly harder because Power BI doesn't really have a join type of between, but there's a way of doing it that I'll show you, and I will give you the sample PBIXs if you want to reverse engineer that, right? So let's look at the harder way first, right? Now, I've shown the M code on screen, but I'm not going to talk through it. It'd be easy just to show you, right? So let's go into a demo of that, right? Okay, so let's look at how we could build this sort of many-to-many table by using DAX, right? So here I have the finished products that you can download, and I can go into Power Query. I'll transform kind of data to see the kind of tables. Now, what I've done is I've got the spreadsheet that has these account kind of rules in, right? So we've got a spreadsheet that we worked with the financial accountants or extracted from the ERP to get the from and the to ranges for each of the account codes. And we want to convert that into a many-to-many table. So I do this in 3 steps, right? The first is what we call the core, right? So the core is where these sum up, but it's not a calculation into a reporting element, right? So what we do is we start off with with a table. We get the table that defines the ranges, and then as we step through it, we see that what I do is there's a DAX function that you can use to convert a from and a to into a list, okay? That you can then expand that list to say, hey, give me every element in that list. So you just see that, see one, like, yeah, 4130 to 4139. When that's expanded, see I get, in the list, I get 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I no longer have a from and a to, I've now got an expansion, right? And then I join that onto the accounts because there's probably not going to be a chart of accounts for every possible combination. So as quickly as possible, I eliminate it back to just valid kind of values by joining on the account. Okay. From there, I now know which line on the report maps to which account, and then what I then do is I merge them and I clean it up, and what I get is this lovely kind of many-to-many table where I've got the report, the kind of line on the report for which particular report, which account key is that kind of mapped to, right? So the important thing is, and I should probably show you the M code here, right? That's the important thing. See that expand list function, right? I've forgotten as to whether that's an M function or whether there is an actual expand thing that you can click, right? I think I wrote the M function, but I don't know if you can use it via the GUI. I'm just going to check. If I right click, is there expand? No, so I think you might have to actually, that's one of the cases where you literally have to type M code, right? Because there is no expand option in there, right? But that's fine, right? I mean, I've got the sample code there, and got to get your hands kind of dirty a little bit. So once you get the hand of that expand, you can find that you can create this many-to-many table here. Now that only takes care of base elements, right? So we've then got to deal with running sums. Now running sums are exactly the same process, but when I expand it, I'm saying expand and give me every line on the report before the one I'm on. So if I'm on line 3, I want all ranges from lines 1 and 2, right? And that's exactly what we do, right? So we look at the running sum. What I do there is, let's look at the expand. Table 1 expand list, right? So expand the line on the report to get all ones before that, okay? And then once we do that, we then go through the same kind of process of joining on the accounts on all possible values and creating that many-to-many kind of table. Now, this takes a while to get to understand. So what I'd advise is if you do want to implement that, perhaps download the sample PBIX and you can kind of step through it and see how it works. A good thing I found is if you get this, you can start off and then click to see, right, I'm finding the first report item. So the very first one, I'm just putting a 1 there. So I now want to go from 1 to that report line. Then I'm filtering out data I'm not interested because I'm only interested in the running sums, right? I'm then cleaning up the columns. I'm then expanding it. So I'm creating that list that I'm then expanding. Okay. And then I'm merging on the financial report so that I can select only the relevant ones. And then the ultimate, I've now got that many-to-many table. Now, once I've got the core ones and the running sums, there's a little bit more work, but I won't go into too much detail, to do with the custom roll-ups. That's where I had like a subtotal, or you might have an arbitrary total, like this row equals that one plus that one, and there's no pattern to it. Now, that doesn't really happen that much in the profit and loss, but cash flow it might, right? Okay. So once I get these, I then just effectively union these on. So if I look at my source for my account map, I'm just table.combine is just combining all those ones there, right? So I'm just combining those, the core ones, and then joining on the running sums and the custom aggregates. I've now got this bridge table, this many-to-many table. Now, most people don't like M code, so it takes a while of getting used to this. The good news is, if you're a T-SQL head and you've got a data warehouse, then the equivalent T-SQL to do that is infinitely easier, because you can insert all of the basic sums with this type. You're inner joining onto that rules table using a between clause. So that's going to find all of the account codes that are in the middle of those ranges and expand them out into a many-to-many, right? And then a running sum is the same thing, but I'm joining the report back on itself to find all rows that were before the report number that I'm on, right? So we find the T-SQL code is a lot faster and easier than the M code, right? But if you don't have a data warehouse, you wouldn't implement a data warehouse just for that minor piece of functionality. Now, I appreciate that that's quite complex, but once that's done, you've pushed all the work down into your data model. So you haven't really had to write any DAX, and that's fantastic for performance and scalability. Having a storage engine only solution is the way to go, right? Now, we still need some measures and DAX, right? Common things that we're going to want to do: budget, right? Depending how the model comes in, right? If I just show you the data table that we get from AdventureWorks, right? So we have the general ledger table here, right? Okay, so see here. Within there, we just have an amount, right? And then there's a scenario table because the amount could be an actual, a budget, or a forecast, right? And for some of our customers, there's multiple forecasts. You know, it could be a normal forecast, then what they call a 3x9, a 6x6, or a 9x3, right? But all of those things are glued into the one table, and there's a scenario that you have to slice. So effectively, there's a dimension that you have to have a filter on, or it makes no sense because you're adding up actual and budget, right? So we've just implemented as it comes in, right? Now, from a pure dimensional modeling point of view, it's probably better to split budget into a separate table. So for most of our systems, we would have a general ledger and then another table for general ledger budget or general ledger forecast, right? The reason is commonly budget has a different grain than the general ledger. So it might not have all of the keys. Budget could only be set at a monthly level. And I don't know whether you might not be doing any allocation to push it down to a daily level. So there's some drill downs that can happen on general ledger that can't happen on the budget, right? So tables that are different grains, it's generally not a good idea to pack them all in one kind of table. And also, you know, the way that column stores work, stuffing different types of data in the same table, it can be more efficient to have separate tables, right? So for all of those reasons, we generally push budget at least into a separate table. Sometimes budget and forecast, because really budget is really the same as forecast. It's a prediction of what it's going to be. It's just really kind of budget is your 0 to 12 kind of forecast before time has elapsed, right? But in AdventureWorks, it's just one table. So what we've got to do is to, when we show the amount, effectively unpivot that kind of data, and we use DAX to do that, right? So if we go to the measure, if I go to my measure and see what I actually use on the report, so the GL amount, you'll see if we just look at the code, what we do is we drag on this scenario, we use a selected value function to say, well, what have they picked? And if they haven't picked any, well, we assume it's actual, okay? And then what we then do is we then effectively put a slicer, effectively a where clause using calculate to say, hey, sum up the base amount, but slice it where it's the actual scenario, not forgetting that we discussed this extra one calculation we do need for the ragged hierarchy. Okay, so we now have two elements of DAX that we're flowing through, but we're still trying to keep it thin, right? But we had to do that. So when we get that amount, we've now got the actual amount, and I should have probably called this actual or something like that. And when we do the budget, then it's the exact same calculation, but this time we're forcing a selection on the kind of budget, right? So what that means is effectively we get the model where you can either put the amount on and drag the scenario across the columns, or you can have separate columns. So you get the best of both worlds. You either have actual and budget as separate columns, or you can have them as part of the model and have a dimension, and we support them both, right? Now, once you've got that, you can then add a calculation for the variance. So variance is just going to be the actual minus budget, and variance percent is going to be that, right? Now, this code isn't particularly optimized because you think about it, if that's effectively the calculation is A minus B over B. Anyone does performance tuning of DAX to see why this wouldn't be an efficient thing? Yeah, because I'm repeating B, I should probably be using a variable, right? So anyway, once we've written that DAX, we can then do variance analytics, you know, actual budget, actual versus budget, variance versus budget, variance versus forecast, and so forth. So that's quite straightforward. Now the balance sheet. So we haven't talked about the balance sheet, right? The balance sheet is exactly the same as a profit and loss, right? It's summing up values based on a chart of accounts from the general ledger, but the difference is the balance sheet is showing the balance, so it's a sum over all time. As an example, I could have bought a car last year, right? So I might have bought a car this year as well. So I have two cars, but they're not within the same financial period. But when I produce the balance sheet for this year, the one I bought last year is still an asset, right? So it's still going to be included in there. Now, obviously minus depreciation, right? So it's a sum over all time, right? So if you go on the DAX patterns, very established kind of DAX patterns, how do I do a sum over all time? Now, this is a very basic way of doing it, and only the most smallest ERPs would do it as a sum over all time. Anyone has a guess as to why major ERPs would not do it on this basis? Well, there's two fundamental reasons, right? One is if you've got a general ledger and in order to produce the current figures, you need to sum up over all time, you're assuming that the integrity of the data for all time is intact. And any historical corruption also corrupts the future. And believe it or not, ERPs, this does happen. Like, old data gets deleted, DBCC check failures or whatever happens, data from 20 years ago gets corrupted, archived. For whatever reason, you don't want to have to rely on summing up history to know what your balance is, right? So more often than not, what happens is most ERPs would produce a snapshot table. So there would be a balance table that says this is what the balance is. Either each period, it redoes the balance and it rolls forward, okay, in which case it's slightly different DAX I don't have here. Or at the start of the year, they'd have an opening balance, and then you take the opening balance and you'd have two parts of the formula. One, calculate the relevant opening balance, and two, sum up the transactions year to date. So year to date plus opening balance, okay? So opening and closing balance, I can't say there's one pattern because it does depend on what your ERP does, right? On AdventureWorks, sum over all time, okay? Now, there's other complexities that we don't have in AdventureWorks, like if you've got foreign currency, the exchange rate, that's the basis of the calculation. On profit and loss, it's usually the exchange rate at the time of the transaction. On balance sheet, it's usually the exchange rate at the end of period, right? So you could be using different exchange rates for different things. So you need dynamic exchange rate conversion. But AdventureWorks, we're just using the one reporting currency, so that's easy, right? So that's balance sheet, right? And when you do that, I guess I'll show you a demo, right? If we go to the reporting there, so now I have my profit and loss here, okay? And my balance sheet showing so I've got my assets, and then from that I'm subtracting my liabilities. And for this, it's split liabilities into short term, creditors under 1 year, and long term, okay? And the idea is that the assets minus the creditors minus the long-term liabilities minus the equity is going to balance to zero. And that's the checking the integrity of the balance sheet. I think I had to inject some kind of data into the AdventureWorks because it didn't actually balance. So I was like, oh, okay. Anyway, that's so we now have these two types of reports coming from the same structure. Now, let's talk about another thing. One of the major benefits of metadata versioning of your report, so the soft coding of the report rather than the hard coding, is that you can now implement versioning, right? An example of that is we described the balance sheet, right? And we said, well, it could have, current assets, short term. There's only one accountant's view, right? And this actually happened. A customer wanted to restructure it like this, right? So I just want all of my fixed assets in one. I don't want to split current versus non-current assets. If it's an asset, it's an asset, right? And then all of my liabilities, I'm just going to lump them. So a simpler view of the balance sheet with less headings. Now, the values are exactly the same, right? But they're just grouped and summed differently, right? So you've got the old version and new, different reporting structures, but it's the same thing. So what we can do here is you can develop, you can go to your spreadsheet and you can key in the mappings for the new structure, right? as an example, if I go to the GL, some example GL rules, you can see here, I might have, these are the rules for the profit and loss, right? If I was introducing a new profit and loss, right, that had different headings, I could clone that new one, give it a new report name, okay? And then on my many-to-many table, I can have different mappings for that, right? Now, I might have to have a different report number or put the report as part of this, but some way to say, well, that's for version 2, right? So in this way, we can have the old and the new version of the report with different business rules kind of generating them, and people can switch between them. Very handy where you've got like a statutory change. We're going to switch over from the 1st of January, but on the 1st of January, we want to see what the old format kind of looked like as well, right? Or where half the people are switching over and half aren't. Sometimes you have different divisions, like you have a manufacturing division, and the accountants in that see things slightly differently. So they want a different P&L or balance sheet than the consolidated one. So this report versioning allows you to have multiple financial reports that are similar but slightly different. And then one of the benefits of that is if I just go to my web browser, bring up my web browser here. So I've gone to Power BI, I've published the report, created a workspace I've just called AdventureWorks Dev, and in here I published a few reports, but one of them is the finance GL, right? And in here I've got my profit and loss and my balance sheet and my cash flow. Now what I can do is I can toggle, see this, I can toggle the report. That's part of the metadata to say, right, here's the old version of the balance sheet. Now give me the new version of the balance sheet, and it will dynamically change to that. So different people can have a different default view of the balance sheet, and that can change over time. So this is a nice trick where you've got to implement change, but kind of keep the old version as well. It means you're not destroying the old version when you create the new version, right? So that's one of the, we didn't actually realize this as a benefit when we first started doing kind of metadata driven reports, but it was like a side effect, and we were like, oh, that's actually pretty cool, right? Okay, so now the last thing that I want to look at is empowering Excel, right? No matter how good you design the Power BI report with drill throughs and graphics, everyone knows the first question that you're going to be asked is, can I have it in Excel, and can I have it in an analytics table, a pivot table in Excel, so I can slice, dice, put things on columns and put things in rows. So let's see how long it would take me to make an Excel version. So I'm an accountant. I see this in kind of Power BI. How long would it take me to do an Excel version? Well, I can use the Analyze in Excel to output an empty version of the model to a pivot table that I can now drop items into. So let's count the number of mouse clicks to make up pro forma profit and loss and balance sheet, right? Well, the first thing I need is the general ledger amount, okay? Then I'm probably going to need, so that's one click of the mouse. I'm then probably going to need to select a date period, right? Well, that's kind of 2 clicks of the mouse. So let's set 2011. This is pretty old data. Then I'm going to need to drag my financial report hierarchy. So this is my soft coded. Then I'm probably going to have to select which report I want to look. Now I can either drag this on as a filter, so that's 3 clicks of the mouse, or I can use a slicer. Let's add that as a slicer. Right, so I've got 3 reports. Let's look at profit and loss. Okay. So effectively in 4 drags of the mouse, I've now got the profit and loss. Now I can clean it up by, I might want to expand that. What you'll see is if I was to bring that side by side with the Power BI, this will be identical in layout. So here's my Power BI layout, and here's my Excel. Now the numbers are slightly different because I'm kind of looking at the whole year here, and I'm looking at months here. But you can see all of the columns are identical, and if I've got the same filter criteria, I'll have the exact same numbers there, right? Now I can now do my analytics in here. So after my initial 4 kind of drags of the mouse to get it in, I can now say, well, I want to see the breakdown by months on that, or I want to look at the other, depending on the dimensionality of the general ledger, I can, now this particular one has department, so I can see, give me the P&L per department here. So you can see that most of my profit comes from R&D, and the most are cost centers, right? So they're not actually generating any sales. Don't ask me why sales come in the R&D department and not the sales and marketing department. I think there's a think there's a problem in the AdventureWorks data model there. But anyway, organization, I can get that to see, well, if we've got sub companies, okay, so that's breaking it down by European country. So I get a different profit and loss per organization here. Okay, and I can do all of the color code and formatting and everything else that comes in Excel. Don't forget that all the time I can still switch to a different report. So here's that in the balance sheet or the profit and loss. Now the only thing is that when I'm looking at the balance sheet, I probably don't want to just look at the movement, which is the GL amount. I probably want to bring on the closing balance. So I do have to switch the measure when I switch to the balance sheet report. Okay, right, that's, once you've got that, you can then come back and focus on the analytics, right? So typically what we do is, once we've got it working in Excel and Power BI, we might come back to Power BI and then talk about data viz. For example, we might say, well, we've got some brushing effects. So I'm seeing a waterfall chart of the variance analysis, time series, and we might do drill throughs. So, you know, I want to break that down by department. So show me that by department. Or if I look at the sales, you might use something like a decomposition tree to say, hey, look at my trade sales, and we're going to let them break down the trade sales. Let's break that down by which country has made the most sales, which department, it's always that department, which account, quite boring, and which month has got the kind of most. So you can use that sort of decomposition tree as well. You know, there's all of the visualizations that are available in Power BI can be used to analyze the kind of data. But before you even start talking about that, you got to get the pro forma reports. Okay, let's look at where we are now. So just summaries, why should you soft code your financial reports in these tables and do that kind of many-to-many work rather than just trying to slap the reports directly on top of the chart of accounts, right? Well, by doing that, it means you're avoiding writing complex DAX, right? Which is good. It allows you to change the report layouts without doing any code changes, and you can implement very easily these sort of custom aggregations and calculated members. You know, you can make them part of the report without having to use any DAX or anything like that, right? So that's a big bonus. As I said, the versioning, that's cheeky extra, right? So really that is a secret sauce to how to make financial reports more flexible and usable and scalable for the finance team. Okay, thank you very much. If you do have any questions, please do drop them either on this blog, or you can actually email me, bob@prodata.ie, and always happy to chat about financial reporting, especially on top of ERPs. Thank you.